In the fall of 1942, the director of the American Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, delivered a message to the people of America.
I want to talk to you fighting men and women about the Battle of the United States. You may wonder what I mean by this. You may wonder why what I'm about to tell you has not been told in detail before. The Battle of the United States took place in every community in the nation. It was a struggle against enemy agents who had been sent to this country to disrupt our industries, destroy our morale, and damage the impact of our fighting armies.
One of the most remarkable episodes in this secret war began at 8 p.m. on the evening of the 12th of June, 1942, as a German submarine, U-202, slipped silently towards the fog-shrouded coast of Long Island, 100 miles north of New York City. U-202 had a very special cargo which had landed at 11 p.m. that night. It consisted of 4 saboteurs who had come to blow up America. 2 years earlier, in 1940, America was still at peace. The New York World's Fair was in its second year. The Brooklyn Dodgers had a great baseball team. In the wheat states, there was a bumper crop. Conscripts in the new draft army were allowed to wear their own clothes on weekend leave. The economy was booming. But over all this hung the threat of war with Germany and Japan. In June 1940, the conquering German army had paraded through Paris. France, once thought to be the strongest military power in Europe, had been defeated in a campaign which had lasted barely 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force in France had been bundled back across the English Channel. Adolf Hitler stood in the shadow of the Eiffel Tower. On the Channel coast, the commander of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Goering, launched the essential preliminary step towards the invasion of southern England, the destruction of the Royal Air Force. July 1940 saw the opening blows in the Battle of Britain. Goering and his Luftwaffe commanders were supremely confident. They had already destroyed the Polish and French air forces. The British would surely crumble. But it was the previously all-conquering Luftwaffe which was the first to flinch. Guided to their targets by radar, the RAF's fighters mauled the German bomber streams. Victory over the Luftwaffe was secured by the narrowest of margins. The invasion was postponed and then cancelled. Hitler now turned to the bombing of London and Britain's ports and industrial cities. The Blitz had begun. The German bombers ripped the heart out of London's East End. They leveled the center of Coventry and many other cities. But they failed to destroy British war industry, and they failed to destroy civilian morale. At the beginning of June 1940, Britain's darkest hour, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had offered words of encouragement to the British people.
On this 10th day of June, 1940, in this university, founded by the first great American teacher of democracy, we send forth our prayers and our hopes to those beyond the seas who are maintaining with magnificent valor their battle for freedom.
By the time Roosevelt met Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill in Newfoundland in August 1941, he had secured the British vital war supplies from America with the passage of the Lend-Lease Act. With every day that passed, the United States was drawn inexorably towards war. When it came, the aggressor was Japan. On the 7th of December 1941, Japanese carrier-borne aircraft attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The first victims of the war in mainland America were the 100,000 residents of the western coast who were of Japanese origin. Of these, 75,000 had been born in the United States. They suffered an exile to internment camps scattered from the California desert to Arkansas. The US government's fear that a substantial number of them were spies proved an illusion. The overwhelming majority were loyal Americans. Now that the United States was in the war, its population was warned about the danger of enemy spies and saboteurs. Most Americans discounted this threat, but it was real enough. Within 48 hours of Pearl Harbor, Germany and Italy had declared war on the United States. It was perhaps the greatest of Adolf Hitler's strategic mistakes, a decision which sealed Germany's fate. Unlike Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese combined fleet, who knew America well and had warned against war, Hitler fatally underestimated the ability of American industry to smoothly switch its almost limitless peacetime capacity to the waging of war. In America, the war was to produce a colossal surge as the economy emerged from a second bout of depression. By 1944, industrial production had doubled, and the United States was producing 40% of the world's armaments. The output in tanks had increased from 350 in 1940 to 17,500 in 1944. On land and at sea, the American genius for mass production was to turn the tide of war. Nearly 3,000 prefabricated freighters, the so-called Liberty ships, helped to win the Battle of the Atlantic. For the moment, however, Hitler was unimpressed. Since June 1941, his eyes had been turned eastward to the conquest of the Soviet Union. In a series of massive encirclements in the summer of 1941, the German army took millions of Russian prisoners. In the broiling summer heat, the Germans moved forward on a massive front. But unlike France, the vast expanses of European Russia seemed almost limitless. One German soldier wryly wrote in his diary that the army was in danger of conquering itself to death. In the Far East, Hitler's ally, Japan, had been at war with China since 1937. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the British and Americans fatally underestimated the fighting ability of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen. The result was a Japanese blitzkrieg, which put even Hitler's conquests in the shade. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, but America's great cities lay far beyond the range of German and Japanese bombers. Hitler drooled about the destruction he could wreak on the concrete canyons of Manhattan, but he lacked the means to do it. For the United States, the war contained a paradox. The sacrifices it was to make in men and material were all on foreign shores. Unlike the British, who were nearly bankrupted by the war, the Americans were immeasurably enriched by it. The waging of war was to make America the world's first global superpower. But in Germany, one man had other ideas. Walter Kappa was a Nazi Party member who had lived in the United States for 12 years and was now serving with WW2, the department of German military intelligence responsible for sabotage. In America, Kappa had worked as a journalist and played an important role in the Bund, an American version of the Nazi Party recruited from German émigrés living in America. In 1937, Kappa had returned home to work in the German propaganda machine. By now, the annual Nazi Party rallies at Nuremberg had become potent expressions of German national will. Holding center stage in this brutal but impressive political theater was Adolf Hitler. The Nuremberg rallies were chilling reminders to the rest of the world of German economic and military resurgence. These massive demonstrations concealed the underlying weakness of Germany's rapidly expanding armed forces. But they were triumphs of propaganda, which preyed on the fears of Germany's European rivals and released a flood tide of emotion among ordinary Germans. War had come in September 1939, with Germany's invasion and 6-week conquest of Poland. While Hitler and his henchmen savored the first triumph of Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, German intelligence was forming the view that a clash with the United States was inevitable. The Polish campaign had been the first of Hitler's short wars. How best could the Führer prepare to fight a long war against a nation whose economic and military potential was almost infinite? Records of Germans who had lived abroad and then returned to the fatherland were held by the Nazi Party's Ausland Institute. Kappa set to work, combing the Institute's files for suitable candidates to wage a sabotage campaign against American war industry. This was to become Operation Pastorius, named after Franz Daniel Pastorius, the 16th century leader of the first community of immigrant Germans in the United States. From his offices in Berlin's Rankenstrasse, Kappa began his search for a team of saboteurs who would blend into the urban landscape of America. Had Kappa but known it, the omens were not good. The German espionage effort against the British had suffered a series of setbacks. The spies the Abwehr landed in Britain had been rounded up early in the war, most of them within hours of coming ashore. They were then given a choice. They could work as double agents for British intelligence or face execution. It did not take long for the overwhelming majority to make up their minds. They began new careers as double agents. The few who held out were tried and executed. From a number of safe houses in Britain, the double agents worked under the direction of a special section of MI5 codenamed B1A, which was itself under the control of the aptly named Double Cross Committee. It was the task of the agents to radio back to Germany a stream of information devised both to reassure and mislead the enemy. To the end of the war, the Germans remained ignorant of the deception and were still awarding medals to their favorite spies after the D-Day landings in June 1944. Even before America had entered the war, the FBI, under its director J. Edgar Hoover, had been hard at work netting foreign agents. A series of trials saw the conviction of a number of spies, nearly all of them of German origin, accused of espionage against the United States. The FBI's hidden cameras caught a number of them in the act. This camera caught a Nazi agent pulling stolen aircraft plans from a hiding place in his shoe. By mid-1941, when the United States was only a few months away from the war, all the Abwehr's agents in America had been put behind bars. When they crossed the Atlantic, Kappa's team of saboteurs would be on their own. Kappa was under enormous pressure to mount a successful mission. The credibility of the Abwehr was at stake as he neared the end of the selection process for Operation Pastorius. From the files at the Ausland Institute, Kappa had selected 12 men, all of them apparently loyal Nazis who had lived in the United States. Under Kappa's watchful eye, they began to train for their mission at Gwenz Farm, an Abwehr establishment 40 miles south of Berlin. They were divided into 3 4-man teams, but from the beginning, 2 men stood out. The first was the thin, ferret-faced George Dasch. He had come late to the Nazi Party in 1939, when his mother returned from a trip to Germany full of praise for the Führer and all his works. During his 19 years in America, Dasch had worked as a waiter and was a man of sadly unfulfilled ambitions. Inspired by the feats of the American aviator Charles Lindbergh, who had been the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic, Dasch had made several unsuccessful attempts to become a pilot himself. But unlike Lindbergh, Dasch's ambitions remained firmly earthbound. In spite of all of his efforts, George Dasch had failed to make his way into the comfortable mainstream of American life. In 1940, he had been required to register as an alien. He decided to return to Germany without his wife, who was then in hospital. Dasch arrived in Berlin in May 1941, just before the invasion of the Soviet Union, and at a time when the German home front was beginning to feel the effects of war. But Berlin had not yet been heavily bombed. Dasch got a job monitoring foreign radio broadcasts. In February 1942, he was attached to WW2. Kappa's second man was the good-looking Edvard Curling. He had emigrated to America in 1929 at the age of 20, having already joined the Nazi Party. When Curling married in America, his wife Marie became a party member too. The couple had separated by 1936, when Curling visited Germany to see the Berlin Olympics. Here he met and fell in love with an American woman, Abigail Johnson. The affair ran its course, and Curling found another mistress, a Florida waitress called Hedwig Engelmann. In the autumn of 1939, just after the outbreak of war, Curling and a number of friends bought a yacht, the Lekala, which was anchored in Baltimore, with the vague idea of sailing to the aid of Germany. But the short voyage of the Lekala was watched all the way by the suspicious U.S. Coast Guard service. The American Neutrality Act made the Lekala a suspicious vessel. She was interned at Staten Island in New York, and Curling was ordered to dispose of her. She was eventually sold in Florida. A small victory for the U.S. Coast Guards. Curling sailed for Germany aboard the SS Excordia in July 1940. After a spell at an army listening post on the Channel coast, Curling found a berth in Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda in Berlin. In the winter of 1941, he wrote to Abigail Johnson in America, telling her, "We know the power of propaganda well enough to know that you are at present the prey of only a small group of Jews. The time will come when you once more find out that you have been fooled into a war that is not yours." Curling was recruited by Capper in March 1942. Capper marked down Curling and Dash as his potential leaders. At Gvent's farm, Capper's team of saboteurs began training. They learned how to blow up railway lines, much as the resistance did in occupied France. They studied explosives in the laboratory. One type was painted black to resemble a lump of coal. Its cavity held the detonator. In an important feature of their training, the saboteurs were taken on tours of German war plants, similar to the targets Capper and his team had chosen in the United States. They were shown the bottlenecks in each plant, the destruction of which would bring the entire factory to a grinding halt. At none of these plants was any attempt made by Capper to conceal the nature of his charge's mission. At IG Farben, the tour was interrupted by a five-star lunch in the director's dining room. The Abwehr had supplied Capper with an impressive list of targets in the United States. Among them was the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. This was a prime strategic target. The railroad was a leading coal carrier in the United States, hauling coal from West Virginia and Pennsylvania to steel mills and war materials plants. The saboteurs' high explosive, disguised as coal, might prove deadly in a mountainous defile. The Abwehr's full range of transportation and infrastructure targets in the United States was highly ambitious. They included the Pennsylvania Railroad at Newark, the railroad curves at Altoona, canals and locks on the Ohio River, the New York water supply system, and the Hellgate Bridge. Aluminium was a vital component in aircraft production, which was now leaping ahead in America. It had to be halted. Annual American aircraft output had been a mere 2,000 in 1941. In 3 years, it climbed to nearly 97,000. This was the economic and military power of which Admiral Yamamoto had been so wary. He knew that the most important war of all would be the production war. Accordingly, other targets for the saboteurs were the Aluminium Company of America's huge plants at Alcoa, Messina, East St. Louis, and Philadelphia. The original 12 saboteurs were whittled down to 9. One of them was already well known to Curling. Hermann Neubauer had joined him on the ill-fated voyage of the Lecala. Another one of the team singled out by Capper was Ernst Berger, whom Capper had chosen to pave the way for his own arrival in America once the saboteurs had begun their work. The flabby Berger was a former Nazi stormtrooper and street fighter who had emigrated to America, where he became a US citizen. He returned to Germany in 1933 to become an aide to Ernst Röhm, the scar-faced homosexual chief of the stormtrooper movement, the SA. Hitler was now Chancellor, but the SA, 1 million strong and keen to absorb the small German regular army into its own ranks, was fast becoming a destabilizing force. The time had passed when Hitler was happy to shower the SA with flowers. he decided to do away with the SA leadership. On the night of the 29th of June 1934, the so-called Night of the Long Knives, Hitler's personal bodyguard, the SS, murdered over 400 top SA men, including Ernst Röhr. Berger survived the purge to become a pupil of and then assistant to Karl Haushofer, a former general whose theories of geopolitics had reached to the top of the Nazi hierarchy. In particular, Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess. But in 1940, while preparing reports for the Abwehr on Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia, Berger fell foul of the Gestapo. He had been imprisoned for 17 months before being released to join the army. After a spell as a guard in a prisoner of war camp, Berger was summoned to Kvent's farm. The bitter rivalry between the hated Gestapo and the Abwehr guaranteed Berger's loyalty to the Abwehr. By May 1942, Kappa's cuckoos were ready to fly the nest. Training was complete. Cover stories had been prepared and, with some difficulty, memorized. After Berlin, their next step was occupied Paris and a week's holiday. The occupiers had ensured that Paris remained the most glamorous city in Nazi-dominated Europe. A bit too glamorous, perhaps, for one member of Kappa's party who contracted venereal disease on their week-long spree and avoided the trip to America. In the summer of 1942, Hitler's empire had nearly reached its greatest extent. It stretched from the heartlands of Russia to the Atlantic coast of France. And it was the ports in northwest France which provided the U-boat bases for the Battle of the Atlantic. The saboteurs' destination was Lorient. By the time the saboteurs arrived in Lorient, Edward Curling was beginning to have grave doubts about the overall quality of the team Kappa had assembled. Dash had already demonstrated his unreliability by losing a packet of documents on the journey to Lorient, and, in the subsequent panic, tangling with the local Gestapo. Kappa's behavior, too, suggested that his planning was somewhat less than cast iron. The saboteurs had been given a huge sum of cash, 180,000 genuine dollars, with which to operate. But at the last minute it was realized that a substantial part of it was in gold certificates which had been withdrawn in 1933. The saboteurs were split into groups. The first, which was to land on Long Island, consisted of Dash, Berger, Heinrich Heinck, and Richard Quirin. The destination of Curling's team was Jacksonville in Florida. Under Curling were Werner Thiel, Herbert Haupt, and Hermann Neubauer, his shipmate from the Lecale. Each of the two submarines taking the saboteurs to America also carried 4 wooden crates lined with steel and packed with Kvent's Farm's special explosives and timing devices. The timers were concealed in everyday items and could delay an explosion for up to 4 days. Curling and his party left Lorient first in U-584 on the 26th of May. Both U-boat captains were under strict orders not to engage the enemy. They ran on the surface at night and below during the day. Initially, the captain of Dash's U-boat, U-202, ordered a practice alarm and crash dive every day. But when U-202 reached the Gulf Stream, the routine was relaxed. U-202's outward journey was almost over. Dash and his men were rowed ashore on Long Island. The U-boat had missed its target beach near East Hampton by several miles. The saboteurs made landfall at the resort town of Amagansett. It was early in the morning of Saturday, the 12th of June. On that day, a mist had hung over the beach as Dash bade farewell to the submariners who had landed his party. His colleagues had disappeared into the dunes to change into civilian clothes. In a few minutes, Dash would join them to bury the boxes of explosives. The successful landing had closed the first chapter in Operation Pastorius. The submariners returned to their dinghies. Unlike the rather more visible La Cala, the U-boat had successfully evaded the airborne Coast Guard patrols which watched the eastern seaboard of the United States. Ashore, the Coast Guard patrolled thousands of miles of beaches, many of them potential landing sites for enemy agents. And now, a Coast Guard was walking down the beach towards George Dash. The mist concealed Dash's colleagues and the departing submariners. Dash confronted the lone Coast Guard and then panicked. He offered the man $300 to forget anything he had seen. The Coast Guard snatched the proffered money and ran off. Dash and his colleagues then buried the boxes, changed into American civilian clothes, and walked off the beach. Within a few hours, the saboteurs were riding the Long Island Railroad to New York. Dash had regained his composure and was confident that he had dealt successfully with the Coast Guard. He had told his colleagues, "I had him buffaloed." No one paid any attention to the disheveled group of travelers. They looked like a fishing party returning home. The newspapers in which they appeared to be absorbed carried some interesting items of news, which might have given the saboteurs food for thought. The headlines proclaimed the first significant American success in the Pacific War. The Battle of the Coral Sea had been the first naval battle to be fought entirely by carrier aircraft, with no warship on either side catching sight of the enemy. Although the US Navy had lost a carrier and 2 major warships, it had gained a strategic victory by forcing the Japanese to abandon their attempt to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea. On a lighter note, the newspapers also carried reviews of a new movie which had opened in New York, Nazi Agent, starring Conrad Veidt. In New York, the real Nazi agents went shopping for clothes. Dash, his confidence now seemingly restored, gave his old shoes to a black shoeshine boy and ordered Berger to do the same. The 2 men then checked in under false names at the Hotel Governor Clinton near Pennsylvania Station. Heinck and Quirin registered at the Martinique on West 52nd Street. They were a world away from Kvent's farm. Meanwhile, U-584 was approaching the Florida coast, having earlier survived a brush with a British maritime patrol aircraft which had forced her to crash dive. Listening to news broadcasts as they approached the American coastline, Curling was alarmed to hear that petrol rationing was about to be introduced on the east coast of the United States. Curling's plan had been to bury the explosives in the sand of a Florida beach and then return for them by car after he had found a new hiding place in Pennsylvania. Now, faced with the possibility of needing gas tickets, he might have to think again. He did not discuss this development with his colleagues, who were exhibiting signs of considerable strain as the U-boat reached the end of its outward journey. Curling's team landed on the 16th of June, near Jacksonville in Florida. They came ashore at Ponte Vedra Beach, buried their explosives, and then treated themselves to a long and bibulous dinner. Curling was due to rendezvous with Dash in Cincinnati on the 4th of July. Meanwhile, Herbert Haupt, the youngest member of Curling's team and the one most recently in the United States, was dispatched to his hometown of Chicago to await developments. Like Berger, Haupt was a US citizen. He had spent 1941 traveling, first in Mexico and then Japan. From Japan, he had returned to Germany by freighter. His family in Chicago had no idea of his whereabouts until he turned up again and coolly informed them of his dramatic return from Germany aboard a U-boat. Haupt was carrying $80,000 in money bags specially designed by Dash. Haupt's uncle, Walter Fröhling, an ardent Nazi, was given the money for safekeeping. Haupt's family had worrying news for him. The FBI had called, asking why Haupt had not registered for the draft. Haupt quickly decided that he would tell the G-men that he had been in Mexico all the time, and he did just that. But when he left the local FBI office, Haupt was tailed at a discreet distance by one of Hoover's agents. Unconcerned, Haupt then bought his father a new car, a Pontiac. But he did not stop there. His next decision was to propose marriage to an old girlfriend, Gerda Mellind, a widow of 26 who worked as a beautician in a Loop hotel. Later, Mellind claimed that she had had a hunch something was wrong. Haupt was strangely silent about where he'd been for the last 18 months. Nevertheless, she agreed to marry him. Haupt's behavior was typical of the saboteurs. No sooner were they back in the United States than most of them immediately began rushing around making contacts with family and friends. They revisited old haunts and dropped dark hints about the business on which they were engaged. Curling had traveled with Werner Thiel to New York by way of Cincinnati. He had been under the mistaken impression that passenger lists were being checked on the East Coast railroads. In New York, Curling abandoned all caution and made a beeline for his former mistress, Hedwig Engerman, and his estranged wife. Curling was convinced that his wife would agree to a divorce and that Engerman would accompany him on the saboteurs' rampage across America, a wartime version of Bonnie and Clyde. In fact, the two women had made a pact after Curling had left America. Mrs. Curling was happy to let her husband go and agreed with Hedy Engerman to divorce him when he returned. But even as Curling mapped out his future, Operation Pastorius was coming apart. In New York, Dash and Berger had decided to betray their colleagues. Later, Dash claimed that he had hatched the plot at Kvent's farm. He was, at heart, an anti-Nazi. It's more likely that Dash had never recovered from his fog-bound encounter with U.S. Coast Guard John C. Cullen. Cullen had only feigned acceptance of Dash's bribe before herring back to his station to report the incident. Cullen's colleagues returned to hear the engines of the departing U-boat and uncover the boxes of explosives which Dash and his party had buried on the beach. Within 12 hours, the FBI in New York had been called in. J. Edgar Hoover personally nominated Assistant Director Earl J. Connolly to head the investigation. Here was a wealth of evidence. German service uniforms, some of Dash's personally designed money bags, a military cap, entrenching tools, forged documents, the explosive coal designed to bring the railroads to a halt. And Kvent's farm's full range of ingenious timers and fuses. There was enough to keep the FBI's technicians busy for weeks. The saboteurs' cache even included a pencil that became a fuse. The FBI had the evidence of a sabotage team at large. but they had no saboteurs. George Dash soon solved this problem. On the 18th of June, he traveled to Washington, booked into the Mayflower Hotel, and after several false starts, got through by telephone to FBI agent Duane L. Traynor. Dash told Traynor that he was the leader of a group of 8 German saboteurs landed by submarine. Traynor was skeptical. The FBI received hundreds of such reports and confessions a week. Nevertheless, he told Dash that agents would pick him up in half an hour. Dash's immediate demand on arriving at Traynor's office was an audience with J. Edgar Hoover. Dash was destined never to meet Hoover, but he nevertheless did a great deal of talking. His final testimony ran to over 250 typewritten pages. By the time Dash had finished talking, 5 of the saboteurs had been arrested, and the FBI was hot on the trail of the other 2. The G-men had almost completed their job. Herbert Haupt was picked up on the 22nd of June, when he appeared at an FBI office to report his compliance with the draft regulation. The last man into the bag was Curling's old sailing companion, Hermann Neubauer, arrested at the Sheridan Plaza Hotel in Chicago. The news of the saboteur's arrest, made public by the FBI on the 27th of June, briefly pushed other war news off the front pages of America's newspapers. Without so much as exploding a single bomb, Dash and his comrades had eclipsed Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, who was launching a new offensive in North Africa. They also stole the limelight from a renewed German offensive in Russia, the drive that was eventually to break on the rock of Stalingrad. And for a while they displaced coverage of the war in the Pacific, where at the beginning of June, the US Navy gained one of the decisive naval victories of the war. At Midway, it completed the unfinished business of Coral Sea, and in the process destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Gerda Mellind found herself transformed from a peaceable citizen into a saboteur's moll. She declared, "After this, I'll follow my hunches." In Washington, politicians queued up to urge the sternest possible punishment for the saboteurs. Life magazine demanded a death penalty. The Justice Department stepped in to inform President Roosevelt that neither secrecy nor the death penalty could be guaranteed in a civil trial. Its solution, approved by the President, was trial by a military commission. The trial was to be held on the 5th floor of the Justice Department building in Washington. The prosecution team was confident as it arrived on the 8th of July, the first day of the trial. The trial took place in secret. The windows in Assembly Hall No. 1 were covered with heavy black curtains. The commission was headed by Major General Frank McCloy, flanked by 3 Major Generals and 3 Brigadier Generals. Leading for the prosecution was Attorney General Francis Biddle. The trial was to last 3 weeks. The principal charge against the 8 men was that they had violated the law of war. They were enemies of the United States, acting for and on behalf of the Third Reich. While wearing civilian dress, they had secretly and covertly passed through American military lines to commit sabotage and other hostile acts. Their aim had been to destroy certain American war industries, war utilities, and war materials. To this and the other subsidiary charges, the 8 men pleaded not guilty. As the saboteurs shuttled between the prison where they were held and the blacked-out courtroom in the Justice Department building, it was hard to believe they were not guilty and already doomed. Poignantly, perhaps, the saboteurs were still wearing the smart clothes they had purchased during their shopping spree on arrival in America. J. Edgar Hoover and his associate and constant companion Clyde Tolson were in daily attendance at the trial. The legal niceties were scrupulously observed, but things looked black for Dash and his men. Biddle methodically built the case against them. One by one, the prosecution team produced the contents of the boxes buried in the sand. The explosives cache in Florida had also been uncovered to reveal its secrets. It had disgorged the armory which Curling had brought to blow up America, but which had lain buried in the sand far from the hotel rooms and bars where the saboteurs had spent most of their time while they were at liberty. Even the snappily dressed, streetwise Haupt was beginning to look down in the mouth. The dogged and skillful defense was mounted by Colonel Cassius M. Dowell, a regular officer, and the tall Colonel Kenneth C. Royal, a reservist. They argued that the defendants had not attempted to commit a single act of sabotage. On the stand, Berger stated that his only desire had been to escape from Germany and rebuild his life in America. He stressed his mistreatment at the hands of the Gestapo. Dash claimed that from the outset, his plan had been to betray the mission. He had entered a not guilty plea to prevent reprisals against his family in Germany. It seemed that in spite of all the evidence, the saboteurs hated Adolf Hitler and all his works. They were in fact anti-Nazis, working their passage back to America. Why then, Biddle silkily asked Dash, did he wait until the 18th of June before coming clean? He had missed a golden opportunity to ensure the capture of U-584 off the Florida coast as it put the second team ashore. The military commission was not impressed, nor was President Roosevelt, who reviewed the trial transcript before confirming the commission's conclusion. Each of the 8 Germans was guilty of violating the law of war. Berger, Dash's accomplice in the betrayal of his comrades, was sentenced to life imprisonment. George Dash was sentenced to 30 years in prison. For the others, the sentence was death in the electric chair. Dash and Berger were taken to a federal prison in Connecticut. Later, Berger was to testify at the treason trial of Haupt's parents and others who had helped the saboteurs during the brief life of Operation Pastorius. On the 8th of August, the 6 men went to the electric chair. A witness reported that they seemed in a stunned, trance-like state. J. Edgar Hoover had the last word.
The recent landing of saboteurs from Nazi submarines sounded a new alert for all Americans. Other saboteurs may try to come to our shores. They must be stopped.
By the time Americans woke up to VJ Day on the 15th of August, 1945, the men who had come to blow up America had been forgotten. The war in Europe and the Far East was over. It was time to celebrate. In April 1948, Roosevelt's successor, Harry S. Truman, granted Dash and Berger clemency. Both were sent back to West Germany, now transformed from America's enemy into its new ally in the Cold War. The men from Krentz Farm had failed to interrupt the production of a single war plant by so much as a single day. When the Allies came ashore in Normandy 2 years after the failure of Operation Pastorius, the might of the American war machine spelled doom for Nazi Germany. It's hard to imagine just how Dash and his men would have stemmed the remorseless flow of material. It is easier to understand how, having returned from wartime Germany to the consumer paradise of America, they lost all desire even to try. 6 of them paid for it with their lives.